Massive protests have brought Ecuador almost to a standstill. Much of the country is paralyzed by a coalition of social organizations, including the Indigenous movement under CONAIE, many student organizations, the Unitary Front of Workers, or FUT, and many citizens in general, especially farmers and workers. The protests erupted after President Moreno declared a host of economic and social austerity measures proposed by the IMF as conditions for loans. These included eliminating subsidies, raising gas and food prices, and restructuring work laws based on more neoliberal standards, among other things. Building up to the protests, anger among Ecuadorians reached a boiling point when the National Assembly struck down a law that would have made it possible to confiscate private assets from people involved in corruption. By the second week of massive protests, thousands of indigenous protesters paralyzed towns and roads, and thousands more arrived in the capital after walking, in many cases, hundreds of miles from their rural homes, all the way to Quito.
We are all striking against a massive increase in food and transport prices, also the government's agreement with the IMF. These agreements with oil, mining, and timber corporations represent a great danger for our indigenous lands.
We spoke over the phone with Andres Tapia. He is the communications director for the Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities of Ecuadorian Amazon.
We're extremely worried about the destruction of the biosphere, and that is precisely the central demand of the indigenous movement articulated under CONAIE. However, on this particular strike, our demands are the following. 1. No to the austerity measures imposed by the IMF. 2. No to a mining and oil-based economy. 3. No to new laws regulating work. So we want to be categorical on this. Our protests are an organic process by social organizations along with the indigenous movements, and in no way is it an endorsement of Correa or any other Ecuadorian political figure.
The fact that the protests, at least from the indigenous movement, do not endorse former President Rafael Correa is precisely a very important part of the issue. President Moreno and other high-ranking government officials have alleged a destabilization plot by Correa as a justification for declaring a state of exception, similar to martial law, and sent the military, and not squads, to repress the protesters. Even the Venezuelan opposition leader Juan Guaido tweeted about his support for President Moreno, claiming that there is a pro-Maduro, pro-Correa plot that is financing these protests. Guaido made these claims despite a decade of Correa's forceful opposition to the indigenous movement. Correa not only imprisoned many indigenous leaders, but also intensified a surveillance state apparatus upon them, violently repressing demonstrations and waiving many of their constitutional rights in favor of mining projects.
The indigenous movement's agenda goes beyond supporting a political or presidential figure, like Rafael Correa was. Historically, in that sense, the indigenous movement spoke for the great majority of the Ecuadorian people. Now is not the exception. Over the last decades, we have been protagonists of Ecuador's social changes.
Recently, there have been many documented cases of human rights violations, including 3 deaths by October 7th, about 600 people detained, dozens of cases of often grave injuries, such as shots with pellet bullets and even live rounds, public beatings, runovers, and even many alleged cases of torture. The official in charge of this operation is General Oswaldo Harín, who was trained in Israel and the School of the Americas as part of Operation Condor back in the 1980s. Harín ordered elite troops and assault vehicles to be stationed outside the Carondelet presidential palace in preparation for Wednesday's general strike. In early 2000s, very similar strikes took down 3 governments, one after the other. However, this time, to avoid being deposed like many before him, President Moreno strategically flew to Guayaquil under the protection of the Social Christian Party, which runs the city and the surrounding area.
The alleged plot of Correa financing us is a lie, a PR strategy, trying to control information. And also, the Correa faction is obviously trying to use our momentum and get on board. We are not supporting any character. Our struggle is about rights, ours and nature's, along with the rest of our demands. They have that strategy, trying to use us on a move to bring back Rafael Correa, but we are steering clear from any of that.
Supuestamente es para el retorno de Rafael Correa. Nosotros totalmente descartado y nos deslindamos de esa posición.
There are supporters of former President Rafael Correa in the streets, trying to swing the momentum in their favor, including the governor of Pichincha and many Alianza País figures. Some, like Luis Duarez, were violently rejected by the crowd. But by far, the core of the protest is formed by the indigenous and student movements, along with an angry population tired of imposed austerity measures while corruption cases involving millions of dollars multiply, many unprosecuted. And while on the streets people protest, in the background, the political right stands to win. Right-wing parties have encouraged and supported Moreno, letting his government do all the dirty austerity work, and they are now in a position to win the next elections and take over a stronger state apparatus.
As indigenous movements, we have proposed a new economic model, away from the current extractivist model, which is not a sustainable model for our nationalities and territories. So for now, that is demand number 2 on our agenda.
Furthermore, Tapia, who represents a group from the Amazon regions, stresses the importance that nature has for the indigenous movement.
The indigenous movement has always been active defending the land, locally, internationally, and even in a global context. We have been at the forefront of the fight against climate change. In our struggle, Pachamama, or Mother Earth, has been represented in one of our main traditional standard flags, and it still stands as such. In that context, taking care of nature is one of our main demands, especially in the Amazon. In principle, we oppose the many mining and oil concessions given all over the country by this and past governments, including that of Rafael Correa Delgado.
On October 7th, 2 official CONAIE documents were published. The first one stated clearly that while they are against President Moreno, they are not supporting former President Correa in any way. The second document addressed several cases of looting, stating that whoever committed such crimes is not a part of their movement, and furthermore stating that they have identified several groups of agent provocateurs sent by the military operating to spread chaos. Follow The Real News for more on this issue.